The rancher had learned the hard way not to
Be
stop
safe.
for strangers on the open plains. And
Always.
here, mercy often came with a price, and the land remembered every mistake. That morning, the sky hung heavy with cold clouds, and the wind scraped across the grass like a warning. He was riding hard toward town when he saw her standing near the trail, alone, wrapped in a threadbare shawl that barely held back the chill. Her dark hair was braided simply, streaked with dust and ash, and her eyes carried the hollow weight of someone who had buried more than one grave. She did not wave or cry out. She simply watched him approach, steady and proud, though her hands trembled. When he drew closer, he noticed the small bundle she held against her chest. A few possessions tied in cloth, everything she had left. By the beads at her neck and the quiet strength in her posture, he knew she was Apache. A widow, most likely. The war and the winters had been cruel that year. "I need a ride to the river crossing," she said when he reined in his horse. Her voice was calm, but exhaustion clung to every word. "I cannot make it before nightfall." His jaw tightened. Everyone in the territory knew the old frontier law, even if most pretended it no longer existed. A lone woman, an Apache widow especially, offered a ride by a settler, could claim protection under the law, and protection came with obligations no one liked to speak about. He looked down the trail, then back at her. The wind cut sharper, carrying the promise of snow. Leaving her here would be a death sentence. He told himself it was only a ride, nothing more. "Get on," he said, reaching down. Her hand hesitated for a heartbeat before taking his. The moment she climbed onto the horse behind him, he felt the weight of that simple kindness settle into his chest. She was light, colder than he expected. Her breath shallow as the animal began to move. They rode in silence, the sound of hooves and wind filling the space between them. He felt her shiver and adjusted his coat without a word, aware that every mile forward carried them deeper into consequences. Neither had chosen. As the river came into view, unease gnawed at him. He had meant to help her survive the day, not bind her fate to his by an outdated law written by men who would never face the cold themselves. Yet as he slowed the horse and felt her steady herself behind him, he understood something had already changed. One act of mercy had crossed an invisible line, and the plains as always were watching. By the time they reached the river crossing, the unease in the rancher's chest had hardened into something heavier. The settlement was small, just a handful of buildings crouched against the wind. But news traveled fast in places like this. Eyes followed them as he helped her down from the horse, their whispers sharp as thorns. He felt it then, the shift in the air, the unspoken understanding that something old and dangerous had been set in motion. They were summoned before the magistrate before the dust had even settled. The man sat behind a scarred wooden desk, spectacles low on his nose, his expression flat and tired, as if he'd delivered this judgment too many times before. The widow stood beside the rancher, her shoulders straight, her gaze forward. She did not cling to him, did not plead. That quiet dignity only made the moment harder to bear. "Under territorial statute," the magistrate said, his voice dry and formal, "any settler who offers mounted passage to an unescorted Apache widow assumes legal guardianship." He paused, letting the words sink in. Guardianship in this case requires lawful marriage. The rancher felt heat rush to his face. "That law's older than half this town," he snapped. "No one follows it anymore?" The magistrate sighed. "Most don't, but it still stands, especially when witnesses are willing to speak." A few men shifted near the doorway, their curiosity thinly masked as concern. The rancher clenched his fists, anger rising not at the woman, but at a system that twisted compassion into a trap. He turned to her, ready to apologize, ready to say he'd find another way, some fine he could pay to free her from this burden. But she spoke first. "My husband died defending our land," she said quietly. "I walked 3 days alone to reach this place. I will not beg to be spared dishonor." Her words landed harder than any accusation. She was not asking to be rescued. She was accepting whatever came with her head held high. The magistrate leaned forward. "You may refuse," he told the rancher. "But refusal means she leaves this settlement without protection. You know what that invites." Silence filled the room. The rancher saw the road beyond the door, the endless stretch of cold earth and wind. He imagined her walking back into it alone, bound by no law, but still punished by all of them. His voice came out low and steady. "I won't turn her out." The magistrate raised an eyebrow. "Then you accept the terms?" The rancher swallowed. In that moment, he understood the law had already done its work. Walking away would haunt him far longer than staying. "I'll marry her," he said. The widow finally looked at him then, surprise flickering in her eyes, followed by something deeper, respect, perhaps, or cautious relief. The law had spoken, but it was his choice that sealed their fate, binding two strangers together in a union born not of love, but of conscience and survival. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm that felt both fragile and relentless. The marriage, spoken aloud in a cramped office and witnessed by strangers, followed them home like a shadow. They lived under the same roof, yet apart, moving carefully, around one another as if a single wrong step might shatter what little balance they had found. He gave her the smaller room near the stove, and she accepted it with a nod, asking for nothing more. She rose before dawn each day, long before he did, and by the time he stepped outside the house, the animals were already fed and the firewood stacked neatly by the door. She worked with quiet purpose, her movements efficient, her face unreadable. The rancher watched her from a distance at first, unsure how to speak to a woman who had been forced into his life by law rather than choice. He told himself this arrangement was temporary, that once things settled, they would find a way to make peace with it. At night, the house filled with silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind pressing against the walls. He sometimes heard her murmuring words in her language, prayers or memories meant for someone else. It reminded him that her heart still belonged to the man she had lost, and that he was nothing more than a name written beside hers on a legal page. Winter arrived early, harsh and unyielding. Snow swallowed the land, and sickness followed close behind. When fever struck him down, it came fast, stealing his strength and leaving him barely able to rise from the bed. He drifted in and out of sleep, aware only of hands cooling his skin, of a voice singing low and steady through the long nights. She stayed beside him, feeding him broth, changing the cloths, refusing to leave even when exhaustion carved deep lines into her face. In his fevered haze, he realized no one had ever tended to him like this, not with duty alone, but with patience born from endurance. She knew loss, knew how fragile life could be, and she fought for his as fiercely as she once had for her own people. When the fever finally broke, he found her asleep in the chair beside the bed, her head bowed, her hands raw from work and cold. Guilt and gratitude twisted together in his chest. He understood then that the space between them had changed. This was no longer just a forced arrangement or a kindness gone wrong. Something deeper had taken root, growing quietly through shared hardship. Later, when she spoke, her voice was soft but honest. "I did not choose this marriage," she said, "but you did not treat me as a burden." He met her eyes, seeing strength and sorrow intertwined. In that moment, the law faded into the background, and what remained was two wounded people beginning, slowly, to see each other not as strangers, but as something closer to home. Spring came late, carried on cautious warmth and the slow retreat of snow from the fields. With it came a rider from town, his horse lathered and his expression eager, as if he bore news meant to unburden the world. The rancher listened in silence as the man spoke, barely hearing the details until one sentence cut clean through him. The old territorial statute had finally been struck down. No more forced guardianships, no more marriages bound by rides and witnesses. The law that had tied his life to hers no longer existed. When the rider left, the house felt suddenly too quiet. The widow stood near the doorway, her hands still, her eyes distant, as if she were already imagining a path away from this place. Freedom, long denied, now stood within reach. He told himself this was good news, that she deserved a choice that had been stolen from her. Yet the thought of her leaving hollowed something deep inside him. He waited until evening to speak. The sun dipped low, painting the land in gold and shadow, and the weight of the moment pressed hard on his chest. "You're free now," he said at last. "You don't owe me anything." If you want to go, I won't stop you. She turned to face him, studying his expression, searching for something he could not hide. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she looked out across the land, the fields they had worked together, the animals that now responded to her voice as easily as his. This place had been born of necessity, but it had grown into something steadier, something earned. My first husband was chosen by my people, she said quietly. I loved him. When he died, I thought my life ended with his. She met his eyes, her gaze clear and unwavering. This marriage was forced by law, but what followed was not. He felt his breath catch. He had never asked for her heart, never believed he had the right to hope for it. Yet hope stirred anyway, fragile and fierce. I will not stay because I must, she continued. I will stay because I choose to. The words settled between them, heavier than any vow spoken before witnesses. He nodded, unable to trust his voice, and in that silence something finally eased. They stepped closer, not out of obligation but trust, forged by shared winters and quiet endurance. That night the house felt different, warmer, not because the law bound them, but because two people, once strangers, had decided to walk forward together, on land that remembered hardship and survival. They built something new, no longer a marriage of circumstance, but one of choice, respect, and a love that had grown slowly, strong enough to last.